Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. Uh, sorry, I can hear the translation. Is that correct? Hi, can you
Let me
hear
check
me?
that. Yeah,
When I am talking, I am hear the translation. Is that correct, right?
lo escuchamos bien. Vamos
Okay.
a bajar el volumen de
Hi,
la
everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. Hi, Johnny. Unfortunately, given technical issues, I wasn't able to hear your talk. It's a really pity. I'm pretty sure that was great. Um, So I will talk about peace and violence and how we can try to translate this knowledge that we get from brain science and behavioral science to performing changes. So those are my disclosures. So first of all, I am a neuroscientist and cognitive scientist. I am quite interested to bringing the kind of cognition that we study in the lab, that I call it domesticated cognition, because it's absolutely different to the cognition in everyday life. Uh, I am really interested to try to connect both. I have been proposing several steps for that. One is a kind of thing that I call pragmatic tone. How we connect that the way that we learn about cognition in the life, the lab, sorry, how can be translated to um, real behavioral interactions in the everyday world. And a simple way is just to connecting, like creating instead to looking at internal validation, providing a kind of external validation, connecting different measures of cognition or emotion or social aspect in the lab with what is going to happen in real life. And this is that my approach to violence. I am being interested in working with different pathways of vulnerability to violence. I will show a little bit about that. So first of all, um, we have been shown with Nano that the experience of violence in Colombia at national level have an strong impact in mental health system. This is an obvious conclusion, but this is an important factor that have a very strong weight in comparison with many other factors that impact mental health. We also have been studied institutionalization because it's associated with violence, and we have been shown different markers of social cognition and moral emotions, and the brain correlates associated with behavioral disturbances. So trying to connect in what we do, what we measure in the lab, to trying to predict different behavioral impairments in different institutionalized participants. The same has been performed with the early criminal offenders. We have been shown how, you can find uh, how inadequacies in the processing of social information and its neural correlates impacts in participants that have different behavioral disorders associated with violence. The same has been shown in the case of neurological patients, some kind of patients like frontal disorders or frontotemporal dementia that tend to have a stronger behavioral problems and violation of social norms. Uh, so this is more or less the approach that social neuroscience and social cognitive and affective neuroscience is trying to understanding or helping to understand violence, using kind of assessment of impulsivity, self-regulation, empathy, theory of mind, social cognition, um, and even pathology, psychiatric and neurological disorder, how those factors impact in behavioral disturbances and criminal behavior. Uh, so how we can consider this approach for this tremendous, terrific, very well needed process of peace that we need in Colombia. How we can try to help to change, a process that have many decades and is extremely complex from political and social point of view. So first of all, we have been shown with implicit measures that they are strong implicit bias involved ex-combatants and victims. And this is something important that we need to think about because when we make changes uh, in this very long established bias, you need to tackle not only explicit actions but implicit processes that are more resistant to change. Um, we have been shown also that we can use tools of social cognitive and affective neuroscience like behavioral measures of moral evaluation to assess participants with extreme patterns of violence. So, for instance, using moral tasks that are trying to characterize the punishment based in the intention to harm versus the outcome, uh, intentional or accidental harms versus strong negative or neutral outcomes. We have been able to characterize some subset of populations that we call terrorists, and I want to be very clear, is not referring to standard ex-combatants. This subgroup of participants were extremely violent people, not represent the average of the ex-combatants. They were killing between 100 and 2,000 of participants, of people, sorry. They were involved in several massacres. So I want to make this point very clear about that to not provide any kind of confusion. It's quite important to clarify that. But you see how with these social cognition measures and a bit of machine learning, we were able to classify and characterize this patient more than with any other typical measure of aggressions or other measure of social cognition or impulsivity or aggressivity. But then when we started to understand the factors that are associated with violence in a more large population and in the typical ex-combatants, we have a completely different picture. So in this study with 26,000 participants, we were able to assess different socio-contextual factors like membership identification, poverty, how the people identify with the illegal armed groups for one side, versus individual factors like antisocial personality, impulsivity, and this kind of psychiatric or individual measures. And we were able to identify the participants that committed different types of violence, like consequentialist, appetitive, retaliatory, or impulsive. I am not going to go into the details, but happy to discuss if you have interest in that. So using deep learning and machine learning, we found very interesting patterns. So first of all, no single factor was directly associated with violence. So we don't have simple linear association between one single potential factor associated with violence and the outcome of violence. First of all. Second, you need to have multiple factors in order to having a likelihood to develop violence, and combining several features, hundreds of features, we were able to select the top 20 that were able to very successfully predict the development of violence in the past. So this is really important because we identify critical factors, and among those factors, social contextual factors were more relevant than individual factors. This is very important for an intervention aspect, because if you focus only in the individual aspect, like personality traits or something that that depends on the individual predispositions, it's really harder to design a short-term intervention. But if you focus in social contextual factors, how you can change the environmental conditions to reduce the impact of dementia, of violence, I think that is a great opportunity for future intervention. Now we are trying to understand how the political influence drives different behavioral outcomes. So we have been doing a similar approach with machine learning process and trying to predict different violent outcomes, but in this time comparing left-wing versus right-wing groups. So we had first reduced the number of factors, and we have using different methods to identify commonalities, and we identified factors that are more individual again, or more social, socio-ideological, or political factors. And with that, we were able to predict some type of violence, but something interesting is that we didn't find a strong difference between left-wing groups and right-wing groups. This is something that social psychology, or one sector of social psychology, has shown, that the radicalization and violence is more associated with the degree of membership to the in-group than the explicit particularities of each group or subgroup. So important thing is again that the social context factors, when are combined with individual factors, have a stronger effect. And they are quite similar between left versus right wings, with some small difference, like, in the right wings groups, military disciplines, for instance, are really important factor versus the membership and the feeling valued by the in-group are important factors in the left-wing group. And the individual factors, like, antisocial traits or personality traits or psychiatric symptoms, are more or less similar between both groups. So what we can do with that? The behavioral insights are a kind of multidisciplinary approach, mainly coming from behavioral economics, social psychology, and other disciplines that trying to apply nudges or bias to make changes, to try to predispose the people to develop more healthy behaviors, or to pay the taxes, or to reduce the violence. And this has been exploited in the era of post-pandemic, because we know how much the behavioral changes have impacted in this process, and how inducing behavioral change is important for my change. So this can be a huge opportunity for violence, but I don't want to be naive, and I want to be very clear. So the nudges can influence behavior, but can change some kind of implicit behavior, some kind of by default behavior. But we cannot, change 3 decades of violence with just changing the communication style of the people or inducing behavioral changes. And we need to address the structural problems that underlie violence, instead of just trying to make small changes. This is, for me, is quite important, because even when I am a promoter of behavioral change applies to violence, we need to understand that the structural inequalities that underlies violence, right? So I want to be clear about that. And I see that understanding the idea of brain, or brain health, or brain capital, as you prefer to call it, beyond brain science is critical. If we want to understand, how our brains or mental life or adaptation to social life is important, we need to understand things that are outside of the brain, that are more related to, poverty, inequalities, and socio-political context that impacts in the habits and the brain. So I am not saying that neuroscience is not important. On the contrary, the brain is important to be understood in the context of socio-cultural determinants, and we need to develop interventions that are based in both social and brain aspects. So when you look at the typical interventions, some of them performed in Colombia, and others, with veterans, war veterans, and other people, that you see is a bit disappointed, in the sense that interventions are usually 3 months, 6 months. They, for instance, try to, training the people regarding social adaptation, social cognition, social dimension that are required to cope with changes. trying to do behavioral changes or trying to address, PTSD and other aspects associated with the violence experience. But the problem with this approach is it's too small. If we want to make big changes, we cannot develop single intervention, 6 months intervention for people that have been, involved in the conflict for 3 decades. So this is the challenge that I want to highlight. So first of all, any intervention has to disarming the mind, not only disarming the weapons, right? So they have to focus in mental and biological aspects that have been learned through 3 decades or more of violence. And intervention has to be, um, uh, longer enough and intensive enough to deal with that. We cannot make change with small or shorter intervention. We need to learn more about how the violence interacts, with multiple factors and how impacting brain health and how we can apply our knowledge of brain health to make changes. We also need to understand individual difference, not only between guerrilla versus paramilitaries, for instance, not only when you think about the complex patterns of victims and victimaries that you can find in Colombia, but also because you can find that most of the people, have been involved in violence just because they were not other opportunities and because they were under extremely vulnerable conditions. Just a small percentage of the people should present, like a psychopathic traits or things like that. So we need to develop a more tailored approach, more individualized approach to intervention. Social cognition interventions, I think that are critical because you need to train the people to navigate in different social worlds. And this is not easy at all, especially not only because what they have been learned or what they have been experienced, but also because the societal integration is an extremely challenged process. We need to understand different cross-cultural research. You can understand victims or demobilizations of violence from, Colombia or, Syrian refugees and many other conflicts that we have around the world in order to understand how the different social factors make this phenomena of violence and reintegration and process of peace very context dependent or not. And we need societal interventions. So they won't be any kind of successful process for interventions if we don't prepare society and if we don't tackle the process of peace in an holistic process. I just want to finish and show some examples how hearts can help health and can be healing. And this is very important because there's so many groups, many of them self-organized in Colombia, that are trying to cope with the impact of violence and how the people can, learn from that and have a better life. So thank you so much for the talk. I'm looking forward for any discussion. A special thanks to Nano for the invitation.